Coming up, a longtime policy expert reviews key legislation waiting to be signed into law in New Mexico, plus major stories from around the globe. And we learn about Indigenous Republicans running for Congress. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amirawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. A number of tribal nations are receiving funding to protect their water rights. That was the message Interior Secretary Deb Haaland brought to tribal leaders during a visit to Phoenix. The Department of the Interior announced Tuesday it will allocate $1.7 billion to Indian water rights settlements that have been enacted. This is important because many tribal nations have settled water rights claims only to wait for funding to complete their promised projects. When asked if the federal government was doing enough to help tribes with water settlement cases, Haaland called it a priority.
That's one of our priorities, and as you can see, we've been able to announce the opportunity to make sure that we get a good chunk of it done here in Arizona, and we're doing our best.
The Interior Department will use President Joe Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law to provide funding to a number of tribes. The Blackfeet Nation, White Mountain Apache, and several northern Pueblos in New Mexico have all reached this criteria. In Haaland's planned remarks, she spoke about fulfilling tribal trust responsibilities.
I'm grateful that the tribes, some of whom have been waiting for this funding for decades, are finally getting the resources they are owed. With this crucial funding, Interior will uphold our trust responsibilities and ensure that tribal communities receive the water resources that they have long been promised. Though this funding can't make it rain or refill wells and reservoirs with water,
the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1908 that tribal nations have the right to as much water as they need to establish a permanent homeland. Even in the West, as competition over water becomes fierce, tribal water rights are often given priority. More developments surrounding residential schools in Canada. Last week, the Kisikus First Nation reported 54 potential unmarked graves that have been found at the sites of two former residential schools. St. Philip's and Fort Pelly Indian Residential Schools are located in eastern Saskatchewan. Officials said, quote, "It's going to be a very tough time for our community, knowing that we had unmarked graves in our community, in our common areas, that we drive every day, that we walk every day." The tribal nation used ground-penetrating radar to find the unmarked graves, saying 42 hits came from the Fort Pelly site and 12 came from the St. Philip's School. It was a busy weekend as Native students, family, and alumni gathered at the University of South Dakota. ICT's Shirley Snavy has this report.
It is Native American Heritage Month at the University of South Dakota. John Little is Director of Native Recruitment and Alumni Relations.
The Native American Heritage Day has been just a really amazing day. We've had 600 people come from across the state, from up as far as Fort Yates to as close to Sioux City and Vermilion. So it's been really awesome to just see a bunch of people come together to support Mason Archambault and honor the 11 Native athletes on campus.
Mason Archambault is a guard for the Coyotes. Leon Leadercharge traveled from Parmalee, South Dakota.
I love coming back to campus because a lot of my growth has happened here, and paying forward to our younger generation and showing them there's a way in the culture and sobriety, alcohol and drug-free life.
At USD, Nick Kennedy and Damon Leadercharge started the Eagle Voice Drum Group with help from Megan Redshirt Shaw.
I contacted Megan and she got Damon involved, and then from there we just started to work with, in terms of protocol, what should and shouldn't happen at the drum group, behavior-wise, and all sorts of different stuff. So just really proud of where it's gone now.
In Vermilion, South Dakota, Shirley Snavy, ICT Newscast.
And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, a look at major stories from around the world, from Mexico to Aotearoa, and which Native Republicans are running for Congress. But first, former Cochiti Pueblo Governor Regis Pecos breaks down key legislation in New Mexico. Lawmakers in New Mexico only officially meet once a year to discuss legislation. Last week, lawmakers wrapped up their 30-day legislative session, passing key bills that are important to Native communities, including in education. Joining us today is longtime policy expert and co-director of the Leadership Institute, Regis Pecos, to break down these bills that are waiting to be signed into law by New Mexico's governor. Hello, Mr. Pecos. Thank you for being here.
Hello, and thank you.
So let's start off with all of these bills that have been passed by the New Mexico State Legislature. There are three of them, one of them to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, another one on the Indian Family Protection Act, and then another one that will give pay raises to Native teachers. Tell us about those and what they mean for the state.
Thank you, Aaliyah. This is really an extraordinary and phenomenal story of resilience and wisdom and vision of tribal leaders, of advocates at all levels, and of course, the role and the influence of Native legislators. And all three are examples of really pushing back on the long history of racism, of systemic and institutional racism that have manifested in these three bills and what they attempt to address. You know, the first response is to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. And this whole initiative was led by Senator Shannon Pinto, who is the granddaughter of the longtime and eldest member of the state Senate, Dr. John Pinto. And it really is remarkable what they're able to do to respond to creating new systems and institutions. And of course, during the interim, this was led by three incredible young women attorneys in the Indian Affairs Department in holding multiple hearings to develop the recommendations that resulted in legislation. And that is to create a new office in the State Attorney General's office that would create for the kind of permanent part of the institutional framework to address missing and murdered women, as well as engaging district attorneys throughout the state. So it really is a really remarkable story in creating new systems and creating critical elements of an institutional framework by using the legislative process. And in a 30-day session, one has to appreciate the flurry of activities. So it's remarkable what Senator Shannon Pinto and her colleagues were able to do to see that become a success. And of course, that is now before the governor for her signature.
Do we have any idea yet when the governor could sign these bills into law?
The governor, by law, has 20 days after the conclusion of the legislature. Yesterday, as an example, was a meeting with the chairman of the All Pueblo Council on Governors, of Council of Governors, with regard to House Bill 60, which is the heart of the tribal remedy framework in response to the landmark Martinez-Yazzie decision that created this watershed moment. And of course, they were asking for a signing ceremony because it's such a huge breakthrough in creating the legitimacy of native language teachers to be treated, given the sophistication and the complexity of indigenous languages, to be treated as our elders defined our own to be our PhDs when it comes to language, and language now becoming part as the heart of a new vision in creating balance between Western ways and the maintenance of indigenous ways. So these are really anticipated to be celebratory moments in New Mexico and in our nation's history. So I look forward to the signing within the next couple of weeks, when tribal leaders can celebrate these accomplishments along with the professional advocates. And I have to say, Aaliyah, that one of the most impressive part of all of these efforts is the role of young people, advocates in their own right, so that when we talk about the third major success in this legislative session, in the creation and the establishment of the Indian Family Protection Act, so that any adjudication at the federal level, particularly with Brekin versus Holland, alleging that provisions of the ICAA is unconstitutional, discriminating against non-Indian parents. And if there's any change at that level, of course, what was successfully passed by another Native legislator, Representative Georgine Lewis, when that becomes law, even if there were changes at the federal level, it would still preserve the protections for Indian children and families to complement the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act. So on the first missing and murdered women's legislation, creating new positions in the Attorney General's office, we were led by Senator Shannon Pinto. The House Bill 60 was led by Representative Derek Lente, another Native legislator. And of course, the third one on the Indian Family Protection Act was led by another Native American representing Georgine Lewis.
So we're really seeing in real time that when Native people are elected to state legislatures, they can create change in just 30 days. They only had 30 days to pass these bills. So very interesting. Mr. Pecos, thank you so much.
Thank you.
From Mexico to Aotearoa, there are Indigenous people all around the globe. That's why Indian Country Today launched a new column called Global Indigenous. This weekly roundup of Indigenous news from all over the world publishes Wednesday mornings on IndianCountryToday.com. ICT's senior editor Diana Hunt oversees the content, and she joins us with this week's roundup. Hi, Diana. Let's just jump right in. What's happening in the Supreme Court in Mexico?
Well, I think there have been a series of victories in the past week for Indigenous people all over the world. And the Supreme Court in Mexico, I would say surprisingly, is one of those places. We've had the Nahua Indigenous community, which is in Tecolteme, and they have won a ruling that a Canadian mining company has to go back and get concessions from tribal communities that are going to be affected. Almaden Minerals it says there are about 7 million ounces of gold and 1.4 billion ounces of silver that can be extracted, but they haven't properly gotten the approvals that they need to do. The community there has been fighting it for decades, and this is a big win from the Mexican Supreme Court.
Let's jump to Canada. I understand there's some funding for Indigenous women and girls.
Yes, a nonprofit there that's been working for many years, decades, for delivering all sorts of different services to Indigenous people in the Manitoba area, has received some funding to develop a plan to end violence against Indigenous women, two-spirited people, girls, and LGBTQ. So there's a broad potential for impact there. And they say that they're very pleased to know that the voices of families and survivors are going to continue to guide these efforts.
One of the major headlines from this week's Global Indigenous column comes from Australia. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is another one of those victories. The Australian government has rejected a bid by another mining company that wants to destroy an ancient stone tool quarry in order to expand its MacArthur River mine. Again, it refused to get the proper approvals, proper consents. This expansion of the mine would threaten a sacred site called Barramundi Dreaming is what it's called. And they're saying that it could really severely impact that area. The government has rejected the application and says it's going to have to go back to communities to get approval. And after a little squabble back and forth, the mining company said, "Oh yes, of course, we'll go back and get the approval. No problem, we'll do that." So it's been another victory. It's another mining victory for Indigenous people.
Let's talk about the Maori farmers in Aotearoa, which is also known as New Zealand.
Yeah, this one is really interesting. I mean, kiwi fruit I think we all know what it is. I don't think we quite know that the Maori people have a kiwi fruit growers association, and they're working to export those fruits to people all over the place like us. And they had the records from last year show that they produced 10% of the exports from New Zealand to the world, and it generated about $114 million in income. And that came even with problems caused by the pandemic. They've been having problems getting people to help work in the fields and to pick those kiwi fruits. And so they were very pleased with the results and say it's just going to go up. And if you're, in the job looking for a job, then you can always go to New Zealand and pick kiwi fruit because they got a lot of openings right now.
Diana, we only have a few minutes left, but I'd actually love to learn more about this Global Indigenous column. Tell us how you sort of find these headlines and how you, pick and choose which ones make it to the website.
Yeah, we have a reporter who works for us, a writer, Deus Dedit Ruhangario, who gathers that information. He's very diligent in searching across the world, various news outlets and media that cover Indigenous communities, and pulling out those items that are important for us to know and important for the rest of the world. And they can be encouraging or discouraging. There were other unmarked graves found in Canada, for example, last week. But there are lots of things that are looking up for people as well. And I think it's good for all of us to know the reality of what's happening for Indigenous people all over the place.
I agree. Diana, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. We are months away from November's midterm elections, and so far, 4 Native Republicans are running for seats in the U.S. Congress. In New Mexico, Representative Yvette Harrell is running for re-election, and in Oklahoma, both Native Representatives Tom Cole and Markwayne Mullin are running for re-election too. Out of South Dakota, Bruce Whalen has announced he is running for a U.S. Senate seat. Joining us to break down these candidates is ICT's regular contributor, John Tasuda III. John was the staff director for the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and he is also a former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Hi, John. Welcome back.
Hey, Leah, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. So let's start off with these candidates. Let's first start off with the re-election of Representative Yvette Harrell. What kind of platform do you think that she's running on this go-round?
Well, she's got an interesting race on her hands because the redistricting in New Mexico, which is being challenged, but I think you have to assume at this point that she will be running in the newly drawn district, and brings in some folks that may not have name recognition for her, and so she has the task of trying to pull those folks in. While she's a member of the Cherokee Nation, she really grew up in New Mexico. And so I think if you see in her first campaign when she got elected in 2020, she really focused on state issues there that were of interest to folks in southern New Mexico, law enforcement, border issues, et cetera, and really kind of, I think, drew attention to those in her successful campaign. She has more of the Albuquerque suburbs now than she did, she didn't have those before. So I think she's kind of pivoting to talk about small business issues and things that are of concern, particularly to the largely Hispanic population in the south side and southwest side of Albuquerque. Very smart on her part, and I think she has a good chance of getting reelected even with the newly drawn district. So, for her, the Native issues haven't been at the sort of top of her platform to begin with, and as often happens when folks are newly elected, like she was last Congress, or I should say for this Congress, they really have some things that drove them to run for the office. And for her, those were border issues, law enforcement issues, et cetera, which are really pressing for everybody in New Mexico, tribes but everybody in general. So, as time goes on, she's become a little more familiar with tribal issues. She's been a co-sponsor of the Protect Tribal Patrimony Act, and so I think that as time goes on, she'll be more comfortable and be more active on those issues. And as her district has changed, I think she has some more of the New Mexico tribal folks in her district. So obviously they're constituents that she'll be looking out for.
Let's switch gears to Representatives Markwayne Mullin and Tom Cole, two members of Congress who know Indian issues very well. Tell us how you think their re-election campaigns will go down.
Well, I think they both are great representatives for the state of Oklahoma, and even more so great representatives for the Oklahoma tribes and tribes in general. They really have a tough issue on ther hands. So the Supreme Court decision in McGirt from a few years ago, is still continuing to play out in the state. And when you're running for office, even if you don't have sort of the silver bullet for a big question like that, people continue to ask you and press you for that. And so that's a challenge they both face. The tribes are not all on one page on that. Of course, the governor and the state is way off heading in a different direction. So that presents a real conundrum for them. And in some ways they have to wait until that kind of falls out and there's a little more vision for how the state and the tribes can move forward, that they could propose some federal answers to that. But they continue to work, I talk with them, they continue to work on the things that are needed today. Law enforcement resources in the state, it's a big issue. And then they're both, they both have been really big supporters of tribal health. And so, Congressman Cole has been on the Appropriations Committee for a number of years, has been really the driver in expanding the IHS budget so that there are more health resources for tribes across the country. And that, of course, remains a major component, of why they're in Congress, and they fight for that every year.
Let's talk about this new candidate running out of South Dakota for the U.S. Senate, Bruce Whalen. What do you know about him, and do you have any predictions in terms of how that race will play out?
Well, I don't know a lot about him, and that's probably where a lot of people are. I'm sure in his community in South Dakota, he's well known. He has an interesting background, but again, the question of name recognition is always a big deal, and running in a primary race in particular, that's a tough hill to climb. I think it's great that he has jumped out there, thrown his name in there, and even if he doesn't win this time around, he's certainly throwing his name in there, and that's where you start developing name recognition amongst folks and pave the way for the future. It'd be great, of course, to have him in either in the House or in the Senate in the future. That'd be great.
And to run for a seat in the U.S. Senate, I mean, that's, a really big stepping stone.
It's a high hurdle on many levels. Not just name recognition, but that takes a lot of money. And I'm not sure where Mr. Whalen, will get the financial support to really put an effective campaign. You have to buy television ads. Really, you have to appeal statewide and really get to those folks that may not have heard your name before.
Well, John, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.